Welcome to SAM Conversation, a program of South Asia Monitor. I'm Colonel Anil Bhatt, and I have the pleasure of introducing three distinguished discussants. Major General B.K. Sharma, ABSM, SM, that's Sena Medal, Bar, means twice. Commissioned in the Sikh Light Infantry, commanded a mountain division on the Sino-Indian border, was a defense attaché to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, participated in track 2 dialogues, India-Afghanistan and India-Vietnam, and has been involved in a large number of discussions in international forums. We have Iqbal Chand Malhotra, a management consultant, Renbury scholar, Cambridge University, 1979, author and filmmaker. But apart from all that, he is a history hound, if I can put it that way. Because if you go through his last two books, Kashmir's Untold Story and Red Fear, the China Threat, the first of which I have read and reviewed, the second which I'm reading, is his history, which he goes into, boggles the mind of the reader. And anyway, it serves a good purpose. Maruf Raza needs not much of an introduction. The second generation soldier of the Grenadiers. He dared to leave the army much earlier than he would have been, than before his pensionable service. And left for higher studies, then got back and established himself as a strategic affairs commentator, author, and columnist, and he shoots from the shoulder. The subject today is Afghanistan on the edge. It's a country which one often can't help thinking of as a tragedy. One is often reminded of that song in Kabuliwala, "Ae mere pyare watan, ae mere bichde chaman, तुझ पे दिल कुर्बान, तू ही मेरी आरज़ू, तू ही मेरी आबरू, तू ही मेरी जान." That's an Afghan sentiment. Now, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the commander of the Northern Alliance, was killed on 9th September 2001. His assistant, who survived, came as the ambassador to India a few years later. He survived because Ahmad Shah Massoud insisted that he keep the passport in his pocket, and that passport saved him. He was Shah. He took in about 300 splinters, of which over 200 were removed before he came to India. And he was on a wheelchair. Iqbal Malhotra has had a number of meetings with him in the past. I had an opportunity to interview him. Now, just 2 days after that, on 11th September 2001, the Twin Towers were attacked. And the US-British forces' first bombing salvo was on 7th October 2001. By 19th October, US forces entered Afghanistan, and by middle of November, the Taliban had begun crumbling. Now, the US targeting the Tora Bora caves from 13 to 17 resulted in a few hundred Taliban, a few hundred Al-Qaeda being killed, but not Osama bin Laden. He had been escorted by the Pakistan Army and the notorious Inter-Services Intelligence to Pakistan. And Yet, it took the US 10 years to kill him. And mind you, in Pakistan, it wasn't any, it wasn't the frontier areas. He was in none other than a place called Abbottabad, not very far from Islamabad, and not very far from the Pakistan's military academy. Anyway, in March 2002, United States shifted its military and intelligence resources to Iraq, dissipating the focus on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. When United States Joint Chief of Staff General Peter Pace visited India and addressed a full gathering at the USI, I piped up and asked him, I said, haven't you dissipated your effort in Afghanistan by entering into Iraq? He says, no, not to worry. We'll stay the course. The US will stay the course in Afghanistan. Well, it took them 10 years to kill Osama bin Laden, and another 10 years, and they're out. It's only highlighted how the Pakistan Army and the ISI had hoodwinked the US. Many US troops were killed by Pakistan's military hunting with the hounds and running with the hares. In June 2011, the then President Barack Obama announced a troop drawdown. 20 years later, even before the last contingent left Afghanistan, almost 80% of it was under the control of the Taliban. No, the same Afghans who were thrilled 20 years ago at being able to shave and seeing Hindi movies, they're now back to being ordered to grow beards, and girls from the age of 15, including widows till the age of 45, are to surrender themselves to become wives of Taliban soldiers, if you please. Voice of America reports that there's a night curfew to, curb the Taliban's movements, and that already the US has bombed for about 30 days at least many positions. That does not seem to have made much difference to the Taliban so far, at least. Now on 27th, Mr. Anthony Blinken, US Secretary of State, arrived with an eye on Afghanistan and China, so to speak. Significantly, he and India's External Affairs Minister, Subramaniam Jaishankar, agreed that as far as Afghanistan is concerned, there is no military action. There is no military solution. The most important force that should have been effective in Afghanistan, that is the Afghanistan Army, despite being supported, trained for 20 years, does not seem to have been able to stop the Taliban so far. And lastly, I think it will be all the number of countries, Pakistan, China, Russia, the Central Asian republics, they all need to be very careful about Taliban controlling Afghanistan. Without going any further, I now request this distinguished panel to come up with the best of thoughts. Major General B.K. Sharma, we please start with you.
Well, I really don't know what really to say. That situation we know in Afghanistan is extremely complex and fluid at this juncture. And our viewers, maybe most of the people who are watching this program, are well conversant with that Taliban today are in control of more than 50% of the districts there. They have surrounded about 9 odd provinces, provincial capitals. They've also taken control over the borders to Central Asian republics, Iran, and there's been some kind of a fighting going on Spin Baduk and Chaman border. And they seem to be highly euphoric. And they've also picked up diplomatic momentum, as you would have seen in the recent past. Their delegations have gone to Iran, Turkmenistan, Moscow, and now a very high profile visit by Mullah brother, who was received by Wang Yi in China. And Chinese have virtually probably heightened their diplomatic profile by saying that Taliban are the military and the political pivot, and they have a significant role to play. That is as far as Taliban are concerned. Now, in the meanwhile, the military of Afghanistan have also recalibrated their strategy, and they are no more going for a wild goose chase in the wilderness and are focusing, conserving their energy to protect the communication centers and the provincial capital. And Americans have also, maybe even reluctantly, despite their withdrawal, have given some air support in some of the recent operations. But more of it is still not coming in the way, because as per the latest report, at least 1/3 of Afghan Air Force has been grounded due to lack of spares and maintenance. And without sustained air support, it is very difficult for Afghan National Army to fight a guerrilla force which retains the initiative. So that is the overall picture. In the meanwhile, there is some unification which is taking place within the political setup there. Creation of the unified National Council, mobilization of the national militia, who are now fighting alongside the Afghan security forces. But on the whole, the situation remains very complex, and I would say the Afghan government at this juncture is quite muted, whereas the diplomatic presence of Taliban is on the increase. In the meanwhile, some other developments are taking place in the neighborhood. There is the Troika, which is doing certain diplomatic negotiations. Central Asian republics have come to the fore. There is this 5+1, that means 5 Central Asian republics plus 1 China. There is another bloc that is 5 Central Asian republics plus US on the other side. And India is also finding, the kind of visits that our foreign minister has very recently made to Tehran, and then he's been to Moscow, and large number of meetings which have taken place in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. So I think there are cross currents of political activism there. What results these yields, we do not know. But more worrisome at this juncture is the security situation. Unless the security forces are able to withhold the onslaught, there is a possibility of Taliban forcing a solution or forcibly coming and capturing power, which would be highly inimical to everybody's interest in the long run.
You, I think, very correctly brought out some very pertinent points, Jan Sharma. Iqbal, what do you have to add?
Well, Anil, the thing is that first you got to understand that Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic society. And while Islam binds them, it also divides them. The Tajiks and the Pashtuns and the Uzbeks and the Hazaras have not been cohesively united or living together for the last 50 years since the coup that took place that brought Sardar Daud Khan to power when he deposed King Zahir Shah in the 1970s. And I'm not surprised that the Afghan army has crumbled, because the Afghan army is also ridden with the ethnic factionalism. And you must remember that the Taliban was created by General Nasirullah Babar in 94. It was a creation of the Pakistan army, and every avatar of the Taliban has been created and supported by the Pakistan army. And therefore, the Taliban's brethren who are in the Afghan army are susceptible to being lured away, and the defections that have been taking place are entirely of the Pashtun soldiers, not the Tajik soldiers. Now, when you look at the ethnic divisions of Afghanistan, you see that the Tajiks are the ones aligned with the US and with India. The Pashtuns are aligned with the Pakistanis. The Hazaras, because they are Shias in a Sunni land, are traditionally aligned with the Iranians. And the Uzbeks, whose leader is General Dostum, are aligned with the Central Asian republics like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, etc. Now, I went into Afghanistan. I flew in there in 2001, weeks before 9/11 and before Commander Masood was assassinated. And I discovered that two things are very important. One is that the revenue that was earned, because Afghanistan has been a trading nation, and internal trade is very important. And the Taliban at that time controlled all the internal trade venues, and they were extorting taxes on internal trade, and that was a source of revenue. The second thing was opium production, which was a source of revenue and was controlled by the ISI. And today the UN has estimated that the value of opium generated from Afghanistan is about, conservatively, about 30 billion US dollars a year. So you've got tremendous amount of cash flow coming in, and that is funding the ISI. So you need today, what the Americans need to stem the rot is they need money that must be provided to the Afghan army. The army chief from the Taliban know that today, if the Americans cut off aid to Afghanistan and spares and money, then the whole system is going to crumble. So they need to keep that supply line going, and they need to keep the cash going, because you're up against a formidable adversary. That's the ISI. They've got every electronic eye in the sky that's guiding the Taliban to victory. So Americans know that. They never had the stomach to take on the Pakistanis. They were in the wrong country fighting the wrong enemy. They should have been in Pakistan fighting the Pakistanis if they wanted to solve this issue. So that's what I feel.
You have an interesting take on that. Maruf, I have read with interest what you recently wrote. Please shoot.
Okay, you know, Iqbal's last parting shot is exactly where I wanted to start with, because I have maintained this myself for at least 10 years or more. And as I was mentioning to you before the start of the discussion, that I asked this question of Professor Stephen Cohen, God bless his soul, in the presence of Ambassador Parthasarathy and Pakistani lady for all parts, Malia Lodi. And I said the same to Professor Cohen, that didn't you go into the wrong country to begin with? It was a knee-jerk reaction. And eventually it led to a book by Carlotta Gall, the famous British journalist, daughter of, what's her father's name? It's a Mr. Gall, who's a
Sandy Gall.
Sandy Gall, who was a primetime ITV anchor. And she also said the wrong enemy. So basically the bottom line is, see, the American initial approach was that of a wounded animal. They got hit badly at 9/11. They were instrumental in creating many of the levers that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban had. They happily turned a blind eye to it, which I had been pointing out to them through the 90s, as long as it didn't hurt the American soldier or their citizen. When it did, they went completely ballistic. Assuming they were into Afghanistan to eliminate traces of Al-Qaeda, which they called the epicenter of global war on terror. It was not a global war on terror. It was America's war against terrorists who America thought came from Afghanistan. It's another matter that 15 of the 19 terrorists came from another big American friendly country in the Middle East. So they got all the mechanics wrong. And though one would like to believe the narrative coming out of White House from Bush's days, one tends to give a little bit of more credence to the line that some filmmakers have taken, that 9/11 was self-created tragedy so that America wanted to be in forever wars. Today, Biden is wanting to get out of forever wars that leak with blood and money and get America nowhere in achieving its core objectives. So that's the first thing. They were in the wrong country with an extended tenure, which should have finished in 1.5 years. Interestingly, Lisa, that when the 9/11 happened, the debate was happening in the Vajpayeeji's government onto whether to send the Indian army or not. There were some sensible people who raised the issue that if Indian soldiers go in, whose command will we be under, the UN or America? We can't fight under the American flag. Second, who's going to pay our bills, America or the UN? The UN had no money. America was ready to pay the money. And as I told Stephen Cohen, that 1/10 of what you spent 10 years ago, which was $600 million. So I said, if you paid $60 million to the Pakistani generals, they would happily go and send their men to go and die for you. आपको वहां मरने के लिए क्या जरूरत थी जाने की? Third thing, the question that was asked by the army chiefs then was, what is our timeline for being there? Are we there for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Because if you look back, actually now we are in the 34th year of a blundered intervention in Sri Lanka. The IPKF went in July, on July 29th, 1987. And in many ways, Sri Lanka was our Vietnam or Afghanistan. The only difference was political circumstances there got us to take an exit route out of there in 967 days. Had we stayed on, we might have stayed on for another few years and fighting a thankless war for somebody else in some other land, which India chose to forget. That is what happened for a lot of American soldiers. The second point is that America, even now, is trying to keep up the sham of being in control of the situation in Afghanistan, when more than 60,000 or so, most of their 60,000 soldiers have left Bagram in disgrace, in a hurry, without doing proper handing, taking over. They handed 3.5 million pieces of military and other equipment that is now being sold in the black markets of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And weapons also. They left it all behind and to hell with it, and they've gone. And now you have American policymakers giving us this nonsense about over-the-top horizon, over-the-horizon operation. And they're also going and bombing the Taliban in support of the Afghan forces. Why do the Afghan forces not fight? Because they don't have, as Iqbal brought out, the binding adhesive. Understand, for me, look at the case of Indians who perform so well when they go out of the country. The binding adhesive is the success being abroad that is offered in the horizon, and the fear, if you break the law, you'll go back. Here, there is no fear of the law, and there is no success on the horizon that can be easily aspired for unless you tick all the other boxes. So, having said that, the Afghan National Army, the Americans, and even I believe some 300 cadets of all sorts are being trained in India. And I'm sure General Sharma will agree with me, you'll agree with me. Our academies don't teach you to pack up and run. You stick it out. So why is it that they're products of NDA and IMA and OTA and they're running away from the battlefield? It could be that they're fighting a war they don't believe in. It's not that they believe in the Taliban, but certainly they don't believe in the American narrative.
Major Sharma, can you throw some light on why the Afghan armed forces have not been able to, for 20 years, they've not been able to do anything to bring themselves up to the point that they can tackle the Taliban?
You see, I think our expectations from Afghan national forces are far too much. As Iqbal has very clearly brought out, that there are so many fault lines within them, and look at the circumstances under which they came to be forged as an Afghan national army. Presently, there are 44% who are Pashtuns and 56% are Tajiks and Uzbeks and other ethnicities there. And most of the officers in Afghan defense forces are Tajiks. They are holding the officer positions. So most of the time it was either conscription or the lure of money or employment which brought them to this job. And then Americans tried to train them as per their own model, right? This was never the Afghan model with Afghan characteristics suited for Afghan conditions. So that is one reason that probably they've all the time been fighting and they've been not trained and they've not, any effort has not been made to integrate them fully into a national army. And that kind of a character they have acquired, the way the government in Afghanistan functions, how fractious the governments in Afghanistan have been. That's one reason. The second reason is that, well, they were always left to do the low-end jobs until at least 2014, because there was a kind of a mistrust even between the Westerns and these people. You remember there have been green over green attacks and things like that. Subsequently, since 2014, these people have 95% of the fighting has been left to Afghan National Defense Security Forces. They haven't had any rest. There are times they have been without pay, allowances, without logistic support. They've been just the gun fodders. And 95% operations they were carrying on. Their survival was special forces, about 30 plus commando companies. And this US Air Force, like whenever this attacks took place in Kunduz and all, it was the American and the NATO Air Force which was able to salvage the situation there. Now, if that support is also gone, what do you expect from these people? The leadership has been corrupt. There have been ghost units which they had created. And there were people of a very old age profile who were in the leadership role. So we've not invested too much in the human resource development and in developing the ethos and the value system of a professional army. That is one reason. Secondly, while Taliban have the initiative and they are a typical guerrilla force, these people got into some kind of a static role where they had to, protect VAs, vulnerable points, vulnerable areas, some, urban centers and things like that. And it was all the time the initiative and maneuver was with Taliban. These are some of the reasons which have led to this present state of affairs. But still, I would say, on the whole, being Afghans, they've given an excellent account of themselves. If there is anybody who's really dished them, I think it is NATO and US Army. They put them in the heaven's harm's way and left at the most inopportune moment. There are series of blunders which the Americans have done. At a moment in 2014 when elections were taking place, what was the point in putting the timelines of US withdrawal? These were not ground-based. Subsequently, the same thing Trump has done. And now Joe Biden has gone a step further. And without permitting these people to consolidate, have their put their act together. They've just left. You look at what Maruf has brought, what had happened the way, they vacated Bagram airport. And I have a lot of details, the way they have dismantled most of the infrastructure and taken all the high-end equipment from there so that it doesn't fall in the hands of Pakistanis or it finds its way into the Chinese. So on the whole, I think it's been a very sordid state of affairs. And I don't know how we are able to salvage the situation. But there are other issues that I would like to highlight, and probably, like Maruf has very rightly said, that what is in it today in Afghanistan for us. But we should actually be very clear how the situation is likely to pan out. See, Americans have gone, and now they are not going to burn their fingers in Afghanistan all over again. They may make pledges of giving them $4 billion US dollars together with NATO, some aid here and there. That aid and all, it doesn't mean much. What they require is a die-hard military support at this juncture. They're fighting for their survival. I don't think that's coming up. Nobody else is coming to their help. Therefore, we have to take a very realistic assessment of whether Afghanistan is heading for a civil war, whether the Afghan National Security Forces are going to reclaim the ground, whether it is going to be some kind of a power sharing arrangement, or whether it would be a de facto division of Afghanistan where Taliban control the southern and the eastern provinces astride Durand line. There is some kind of a fighting which will keep taking place around Kabul and some of the other provincial councils. And there is heightened fighting in the northern and the western provinces where Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, Ahmad Massoud, and some of the other erstwhile Taliban leaders, they will not permit, Taliban to have a strong foothold in that area. So I see more and more fighting will intensify in the northern and the western provinces, and they would be raised for the provincial council, and Taliban de facto would control the southern and the eastern provinces. Now, how does that scenario impact India? What is at risk? I won't take time. Maybe other guests would like to deliberate upon that, and then we can continue with the discussion.
No, General Sharma, you very, correctly brought out some very disturbing aspects about the weaknesses of the Afghan forces and the mistakes that the US made. There's no doubt about the fact that Pakistan can do no wrong even after it is responsible for a few thousand American soldiers getting killed. Iqbal.
See, let me tell you one thing, and that's very clear, that the future of Afghanistan lies in the hands of Pakistan. Now, during my last trip to Afghanistan was about 16 years ago in 2005. At that point of time, the Tajiks were already stockpiling weapons and ammunition for the eventual civil war that was going to happen once the Americans departed. Now, they've been at it for 16 years. And as General Sharma said, that Ahmad Massoud is going to lead the Tajik forces, and he's going to be supported by Amarullah Saleh, whom I had occasion to meet 20 years ago when I was there, when he was a translator for President Massoud, for Commander Massoud. And then he was the chief of the Afghan intelligence. And now he's the first vice president of Afghanistan. The Chinese have used the Pakistanis because the Chinese thrust is to build a road from Peshawar to Kabul and then extend it from Kabul to Tehran and Kabul to Ashgabat. Now, Ashgabat, which is the capital of Turkmenistan, which is on the western border of Afghanistan, they have about almost 1/4 of the world's natural gas supplies. They have two very big gas fields. I visited one, which is at the tri-junction of Iran and Afghanistan in 2002. That's called the Daulatabad field.
and the other one is the one up north, which is called the Galkanish field. Now, they want to connect these gas fields to road links and to rail links, the Chinese. So their thrust is to subdue Afghanistan completely. The Pakistan army is going to leave no stone unturned to completely crush all resistance. They will, however, find it very difficult to enter the Panjshir Valley, which is going to continue to remain the hideout of the Tajik forces. And they will launch guerrilla attacks on the Pakistanis now and then. There is enough money from opium to fund the entire enterprise. And once the Chinese have built the road and rail link up to Tehran and Ashgabat, the Turks will be able to come all the way down to Ashgabat, and India's initiative at Chabahar will be completely marginalized. It will be, all that money will have gone waste, because the whole of Central Asia will be joined to the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's what the Chinese are looking to do. And that's what their subalterns, the Pakistanis, are doing. And in the process, the collateral benefit for Pakistan is that they continue to exploit the opium. They have strategic depth. They will continue to get cannon fodder of Pashtun youths to be sent into India. Now, the danger is, and this is the spillover. Number one, the Chinese will start injecting cheap opium derived drugs into India, because they have got this thirst for revenge for what we did to them in the century of humiliation from 1839 to 1939, when Indian opium was used to make China a nation of addicts. Secondly, what is going to happen is that if the radicalization of Afghan society spills over into Pakistan, you will find that those Pakistanis who don't want to succumb or yield to radicalization will then want to escape from Pakistan into India. Now, what is going to happen if 10, 15 million Punjabi refugees from West Punjab, who are unwilling to live under strict Islamic laws, even stricter than they are today, want to escape into India? How are you going to stop them at the border? What is your contingency plan for that? Are you going to lay minefields? Are you going to machine gun them? What are you going to do? Are you going to accommodate them? Because this civil unrest in Pakistan is something that nobody has factored into, and that is what a major war game needs to be created and done to figure out how are we going to deal with that issue. So that is the spillover that I fear from Pakistan and not from Afghanistan, because Pakistan society itself is very tenuous. And how long the Chinese can hold it together, I don't know. And how long the army can hold it together, I don't know, because once this onslaught of radical Islam seeps into the Punjab, it is going to create many divisions there within Pakistan.
Thanks, Iqbal. Some very pertinent points you brought out. Maruf, you know, we were the first to begin our reconstructive effort, the reconstruction, and we were the first to set up a embassy and consulates there. We made a very world-class road from Zaran to Dilaram. There are so many assets that we've created. What do you think is going to be the security of such these assets?
You see, despite the historical linkages with Afghanistan, despite the Afghans holding India in very high stead, and Ambassador Khalili being here, who I've also met, and I was there with Jaswant Singh for the inauguration of the refurbished Indian embassy in Kabul.
Yes.
The fact remains, all that, I think, it's a very blunt view to have. I think you should just consider it as an act of charity and move on. Because quite frankly, there is an old military adage, don't reinforce failures. So don't go in somewhere where the angels fear to tread. And quite frankly, Afghanistan is at that. I may be sounding very blunt and harsh, but in life, when you are faced with a situation where you have limited ammunition and resources, there are many cases of army officers who've chosen to stand there and die and tell their colleagues, you retreat and get out of harm's way. The example of Captain Hanif at Turtuk is a case in point during Kargil.
Yes.
But what I'm trying to get at is, you see, Afghanistan has multiple scenarios that you can war game, as Iqbal says. But when at the peak of everything, when it was going right, American influence was quite considerable. Now it is zilch. You didn't get invited to the high table. You were asked to wait outside the door to get the press release. You had eminent retired ambassadors from India, one ex-ambassador to Afghanistan, one ex-envoy to Pakistan, going in as observers to meetings in Moscow. And now you have another retired ambassador who's a champion of our getting involved there in Afghanistan. Says, after all, we were always engaging with the Taliban. Then why this hypocrisy? On one side, we said what the Americans were saying, that the Taliban was unbearable, unpalatable. And you have Zalmay Khalilzad going and working out an arrangement with the Taliban that has given them every benefit of doubt so that America could exit from there. And I'm sorry to say, Zalmay Khalilzad sold himself to the idea of continuing to get his package as advisor from the Trump government, because Trump said, get me an exit plan and don't waste my time with all sorts of other variables. And now, strangely, the Biden administration's also hired him. So he seems to have a way of getting around in Washington while continuing to keep his pad there in Washington and his place here in Kabul. Now, the point is, Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister of India, with due respects, I have heard people who worked with him to say that he was completely sold out to the American narrative. Why is it, let's ask a question, that Mr. Dr. Manmohan Singh, the eminent academic, never visited any third world country in his tenure as Prime Minister? He only kept shuttling to Washington and a few other fancy capitals of the world. And he's the man who continued to pour money down Afghanistan. I mean, you had put $2 billion or $3 billion into Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, you'd have a safer neighborhood here. You could neither prevent the spillover from Afghanistan into Pakistan, as Iqbal's bringing out, and I'll tell you why. Because in Pakistan, people were always collecting charity for the Taliban. Now more so, they're collecting for Taliban and the jihad that is following now. They welcome the Taliban. American and other diplomatic envoys have said the reason why the Taliban, even when wounded by US soldiers, survived, because they got medical care in Pakistan. They got shelter there. Their families were there. Not just Osama bin Laden, the whole works. And we are now, knowing all that, still going in and wanting to burn our hands. You want to burn your hands? Fine. Then get aggressive in Iran and get that Chabahar port consolidated in such a way that it gives you access into West Afghanistan through the rail line that goes from Chabahar. And the second thing that you can do is, this argument that spillover from Pakistan into India, I find it still hard to digest. And I'll tell you why. The Pakistan army, the only institution it cares for is itself. And it's not going to let hoodlums run over the army. It's still a pretty lethal fighting force. And if it can take on the Indian army and keep us on our tenterhooks, despite numerical inferiority, then they can do pretty much a lot of damage to those hordes which are trying to run all over Pakistan as if it is Highway 219 connecting Kashgar to Lasha. It is not. They'll be stopped at certain stages because in the middle will lie the Pakistan Army's entire empire. That empire didn't survive on the American handouts of 33 billion over 10 years or 20 years. That empire survives on $19 billion a year from the drug trade. I'm not saying it, Aisha Siddiqa says, who is perhaps the most authoritative person on Pakistan's army in a book, Military INC. So, champagne caviar to wahan se aa raha hai. America's billions was only shopping money. And that is what they went and told America, that they're going to fight terror with weapons that America gave. Virtually all the weapon platforms were anti-India. And the stupid, I always say Washington has more think tanks than the British Army has tanks. But they still can't seem to get one thing right. And that is why I don't trust anybody who says that America has suggested this, so we should do that. And I'm sorry to say that even in the current administration in India, we have a lot of people who seem to be veering only in America's direction and wanting to be in America's good books. But we have very little in common with America, except that we are democracies. But then again, what kind of democracy we are vis-a-vis what kind of democracy they are is a matter of a separate debate. So I mean, I've been very hard-hitting, but let me tell you, my views are that we should let Afghanistan be where it is and get the world's other countries. The SCO is an active platform. Sab wahan jaate hain. Jaishankar Saab jaate hain. Rajnath Singh jaate hain. And even Mr. Doval has gone there. Why don't you let the damn SCO take on the responsibility of Afghanistan? Why do you have these cultural clubs that keep meeting regularly to just basically exchange niceties and photo ops? Give them a role. And the SCO, because it operates largely out of Central Asia, tell them that this affects Central Asia, they should get involved. And if Pakistan wants to, as Iqbal rightly says, the only country that has influence in Afghanistan is Pakistan, let them get involved, let them burn their fingers. If the biggest power in the world could not take on Afghanistan, if Pakistan knows a trick or two, let them go and do it. Our investments were done with a purpose, but quite frankly, I think we should have read the writing on the wall in the beginning only, in the first 10 years, कि आपके investments आपको कमरे में घुसने नहीं दे रहे हैं. आप बनाते रहिए dam, roads, schools, hospitals, and even parliament building. But the Taliban probably even destroy the parliament building because they don't believe in parliamentary democracy. But anyway, all that having said, I have very strong feelings about it. And I just feel that there are many other initiatives where we could have done better, like getting involved, but we've chosen to stay out of it. One classic example is the RCEP, which is a trade arrangement where we would have benefited. We've kept out of there. And we're going and sinking ourselves in a quagmire called Afghanistan. So I'm sorry, I'm not for it.
Yes, Iqbal, before you take on, what's been on one's mind is that the Taliban were created by Pakistan, fine. But the Taliban were also let down by Pakistan when, it almost sort of handed over the Taliban to the US forces. It's a different thing that the US couldn't do anything about finishing them off. That's a separate. Now, it's a very a very serious situation, because what is going to be the relationship between the Pakistan army, the Pakistan military, and the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, the Taliban in Pakistan also? I think both. I would like all the comments from all three.
I'd like to say a couple of points here, quick points.
Okay.
The first thing, I disagree with you when you say that the Pakistan army let down the Taliban. They never let them down. In fact, the last flight of a Pakistan Air Force C-130, which was permitted by the Americans in 2001 to fly to Kunduz, got out the top Taliban leadership, and the entire Taliban leadership was given refuge in Pakistan. And as Maruf said, that they were provided shelter, their families were looked after, and they were provided medical aid, they were provided ammunition. I myself went on a mission in the Nangarhar province with the American Army in 2005, and the colonel on the ground who was heading that mission said, and I've got him on camera in one of the films I made, he said, this ordnance and these weapons have all got Pakistani markings. They are not from the Soviet era. The Pakistanis were supplying them with weapons even then in 2005. The second point I want to make is that despite the power of the Shah of Iran, and despite his invincible army, and despite the fact that there were no ethnic divisions in Iran, the power of Mr. Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, and fundamentalist Islam swept the Shah aside.
We seem to have lost
Yeah.
Iqbal.
And the meanwhile, can I just come
Yes,
in?
please,
Yeah, yeah.
Vinit Sharma, take on
Yeah.
from there.
See, so firstly, I would like to make a big point that in the ongoing fiasco there, I think nobody is a gainer, not even Pakistan. If anybody who's gaining out of this situation presently is China, because they played their cards extremely well. They kept their channels open with everybody, and they've sealed their borders, 100-kilometer long border along that Wakhan corridor. Not even fly can cross into China through that border. You know, there are multiple layers of security arrangements there. And they are now saying we will come out with a liberal kind of a package and respect the power sharing arrangement. I think whatever situation there may be, it is going to compound Pakistan's strategic dilemma. I know from first-hand information that when this fellow, this Mullah Umar, he was at the helm of affair. Nasrullah Babar, who was the interior minister, he approached him and he said, now you are in control. Why don't you recognize the Durand line? And he told him, get out. This is a question of Pashtun nationalism. And over my dead body, it is only Loya Jirga which is going to decide about the question of Durand line. And very recently, when Shah Mahmud Qureshi was asked this question by one of the Afghan reporter, that what are you going to negotiate the Durand line with Taliban? He said, we are not going to talk even to Taliban on Durand line. So Durand line is going to be the most contentious issues because that is an element of Pashtun nationalism. Now, you look at Pakistan doesn't want a very strong Taliban because Taliban is not a monolith. While Haqqani network may be under control of Pakistani establishment, but there are 19 other groups who are presently aligned with Pakistan, but they have their own differences. And I very much guess that some kind of infighting at some point or the other is going to break out within Taliban themselves. Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan, Daesh, you have these Eurasian groups who have very different priorities and orientation. So they are going to get involved in internal fighting. Now, the recent report which has been released by the UN, there are about 6,000 Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan, and most of these people are actually 70% of Arkazai and Afridi tribes from northwestern provinces. Now, these people together with Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan are having the patronage of Taliban, and also Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda today has become more active in about 9 provinces there, and they are supporting not only Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan, but other groups like Ahrar, whether you call it Hizbul Ahrar or you call it Jamaatul Ahrar. These people have become extremely active in Balochistan. You know, there's been another firing in Karachi on the Chinese diplomats there. Yesterday, besides that, you know, that bus incident and the hotel incident, now these people are not going to spare them. So that, besides that, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement definitely has certain resonance on this side of Durand line. Therefore, Pakistan itself doesn't want a very strong Taliban regime to come. They also are looking for some kind of a power sharing arrangement. As far as India is concerned, I think it's a hot potato in our hands, and the best bet for us at the moment is we should not take the American bait. Take a very detached and dispassionate view of the whole situation there. Hedge your bets there. See that no Kandahar-like crisis or some of a mission, becoming a target, it doesn't take place. Keep your range of contingencies open and let others fight there and see whatever comes. It doesn't affect us. I think it is totally, I would say, a misnomer that even we had an element of chance through Chabahar, Ziranj, Dilaram Road. You look at the alignment of that road. It passes through Faryab and Helmand province. And that is the stronghold of Haqqani network. Even if we would have made that road, we would have never been able to operationalize that road or have any container trade which was commercially beneficial. So therefore, at this moment, I think while we can make good diplomatic overtures, but on the whole, we should have a hedging strategy, bide our time and see how situation pan out, and go for more of a covert, low-level kind of a backdoor diplomacy than to make big noises.
Anil, I'd just like to pose a question to Maruf.
Yes.
My idea, I got cut off because the electricity, there was a power cut at my
Yeah.
house. My view is that India should consider providing a line of credit to the extent of 100 million to 250 million US dollars to the Tajiks. Because my assessment is that Afghanistan is going to break up into 3 or 4 parts. And definitely there's a Pashtun part, there'll be a Tajik part, and then there'll be a Uzbek Hazara part. So you need to keep on arming the Tajiks, provide them with weapons, provide them with money, whatever you want. Be proactive, but don't abandon the Tajiks, because they will conduct all the guerrilla attacks on the Pakistan army and the Chinese construction forces that land up in Afghanistan to build the Peshawar to Kabul highway and onwards from Kabul. So I mean, I don't know if Maruf agrees with this view.
I think it's a great idea, because I'm not saying pull yourself out completely from your entire engagement investments there. I'm just saying don't continue to keep sliding down the black hole. But when you can put in $3 billion, what is 100 million or 200 million? It's not even 10% of that. And how you can do it? We have an air base, as Iqbal knows only too well, in Dushanbe. And Dushanbe is in Central Asia. So we don't have to be dependent on Pakistan for air access to those countries. And even when our diplomatic staff was flown out of Afghanistan after things began to fall apart in Kandahar and elsewhere, they flew out of airspace that was not Pakistan's. So quite clearly, we can go there through a little more convoluted route, but since we are not going to have to maintain such a huge logistics lifeline like America's and American troops required, we can go in with money bags. And I go back to my old thesis. You want somebody to be an element in play in a conflict. You don't have to put your boots on the ground every time. You pay for it. If Americans had paid the Pakistan army would happily, I mean, they have sold their damn souls to the Chinese for $64 billion, the CPEC. They would have sold their mothers to America for $60 billion. I'm sorry to say that. But that is the nature of Pakistan Army's basic approach to things, that money counts. So you use your money bags to get the Hazaras, the Tajiks and others to get engaged with. After all, even when the Taliban was in control earlier on in the 90s, the Northern Alliance was basically being funded by us and supported by us. I have met many Afghans and their families who were given homes and a certain anonymity in India. So why can't we continue to do that And if Afghanistan is going to be a fractured land, so be it. You know, a lot of these artificial lines that were drawn during the days of the empire, they're not really reflecting the truth. Iqbal will agree with me that the artificial lines that made up the state of Jammu and Kashmir basically was 5 regions. There was Jammu, there was Kashmir Valley, there was Ladakh, there was what we call the Gilgit-Baltistan area, and what we call the POK region. So all that made up Jammu and Kashmir. Now, whether it was Mr. Johnson who was paid money by the Maharaja to extend the boundary lines to what became the Johnson line up till Haji Langar, or it was somebody else who decided to make another set of lines and define Pakistan's northern territories, and then the British got it taken over by Major Brown. But the fact is, if Kashmir, and look at it, what cost, I know Jan Sharma, being from Kashmir, will have very strong views about it, but it has cost us, but we're willing to pay the price. But would Pakistan be willing to pay the price to hold the artificial Afghanistan together? Afghanistan में Karzai को जो president बनाया, he was a Pashtun. The Taliban are Pashtun. Now the Taliban are different when they are inside Pakistan and different when they are in Afghanistan. You know, there are two divergent views. So the ones who are operating in AFPAC region are not totally on the same page as the guys who are going hammer and tongs for Kabul. And to some extent, Pakistan Army has levers on the guys who are within Pakistan, not so much as there, because when you create Frankenstein monsters, they come to hound you and they come to eat you up. So I am completely for, if India has the money and energy, and you should make Iqbal advisor-in-chief of Afghanistan project, get him to go and create turmoil in Afghanistan. Make it so damn difficult for Pakistan, who's obsessed with strategic depth and controlling Afghanistan, that they will sell anything to be in control of that. Because Mirza Aslam Beg, General Mirza Aslam Beg, who succeeded Ziaul Haq, the day he took out his Ray-Ban sunglasses, he came up with a brilliant, so-called brilliant idea of Pakistan having a strategic depth in Afghanistan. And it's become an article of faith. When you talk to Pakistanis, they can't justify that. I said, you have assumed you will lose to India and you'll run away to Afghanistan to regroup, to come and push India back. और हम इतने कमजोर हैं कि वहां घुस गए तो हमको आप धक्के मार के निकाल दोगे. So this is absolute nonsense. But Pakistan's wedded to that article of faith, just like they're wedded to the fact that Kashmir unka hai and Kashmir ki insurgency indigenous hai, and they have the golf cap wearing Salahuddin giving mumbled utterances once in a while to say ki bhai, here is the champion of indigenous Kashmiris. But let's get real. I follow foreign policy, I don't practice it. But I've got some very pragmatic views about these things. And the one thing that a good army officer learns, that all plans that you put together go for a 6 when the first bullet is fired. Thereon, your training and imagination takes over to innovate and take control of the situation. So your plans may be put in the dustbin, whatever all these guys weave in South Block. I mean, I have an absolute allergy to the South Block pundits because they, like Washington's think tanks, they get everything wrong. You know, it was assumed at one stage that there would be a highway that would come from Kabul and go to Calcutta and beyond, and that would emotionally link South Asian countries together. China has crossed that damn highway the other way around with the CPEC, and your highway has gone for a 6. So now suddenly you've woken up to it, and all along, I mean, can you believe I've met any number of Indian diplomats? You know, the one thing that a very distinguished Indian politician who's no more said, that our foreign policy will only get real when the people at the top are not of the generation that was born and brought up in Pakistan. Sorry to say that, but Iqbal might disagree. but there were a lot of
That-
people who said,
that's,
you know, that Sada Pind to utthe hai. But it's lost territory. You either have to be there or you have to be here. So likewise, you've got to get real. And I believe an approach rooted in reality will make you a much, much more important player than waiting for America to call out to you with a doorbell and said, come inside, we'll invite you now to give your 2 bits worth. Nonsense. You refuse to be part of any discussion like that. And I tell you, I respect Pakistan for only that thing. They spell out their foreign policy goals and they get everyone to fall in line. They are able to use their strategic location and strategic weight a lot better than we can, despite all the God-given advantages we have.
well, Maruf, you said quite a bit, and but I think we've come out with a lot of very, very pertinent and some very disturbing points, but facts all the same. Jalil Sharma, is there anything more you'd like to add?
I think
Closing the
yeah, the
winding
most
up remarks, please.
the most refreshing point of this discussion has been what actually we can do there. And I think there is a little, there is a concert of opinion that we need not sit on our haunches, but actually help people who are the genuine friends of India. And I would say 3 leaders. One is General Atta, who is a very strong leader in Balkh area. Then we have Ahmad Masood. You have people like Spanta, who's been the former foreign minister and national security advisor. And you have Saleh, the kind of Twitter posts he's putting up. But the question is, how do we help these people? And there are real problems because the situation, I was there in Central Asia when Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated, and I have first-hand information about Aini and that military hospital which we are operating, but that is for some other discussion. Today, there are problems like what Maruf said. Ideally, yes, we should use that Aini base, but the geopolitical developments today are not very conducive for India to exercise that kind of an option. Chinese wield overwhelming influence on Tajik, and even Russians who are controlling the airspace. We have just a presence there, but the whole air defense of that base and surrounding areas has been controlled by Russians there. And Russians, you see what statement their ambassador made very recently in New Delhi, and what this Kabulov, the kind of statements, they are not very friendly statements towards India at this juncture. But I think we have to play our diplomatic cards very well, get Iran and Russia on board. Because a strong Taliban or a fundamentalist regime in Afghanistan is not in their long-term interest. Neither Iranians are liking it, nor Russians are going to like it, and Central Asian Republic will mostly do in the security arena what Russia tells them. Therefore, to exercise this option, we have to rebuild our bridges with Iran and Russia, and then see that we play our Northern Alliance or new Northern Resistance Front card very well. I very much go with the idea, but certain ground level realities will have to be factored in.
I would have asked Iqbal, but we've lost him again. Maruf, is there anything you'd like to add finally?
No, General Sharma's view is far better than mine. It's much more nuanced. And, I am basically a hard-hitting go-getter. That's me. But sometimes you have to speak the blunt truth for people to suddenly wake off from their slumber and realize that, yes, there is another argument that is there. The bottom line is, if Pakistan is obsessed with Afghanistan, just make it expensive for Pakistan to be there. Expensive in money, resources, and manpower. And the best way you can do that to them, you can do to them in Afghanistan what they're doing for you in Kashmir. QED.
And without putting any feet in the ground.
Absolutely.
Without putting any feet in the ground with a little money power. That's no doubt.
provide it. My 2 points, concluding remarks are, we need to consider providing a line of credit, immediate line of credit to the Tajiks of annually of between 100 billion to 250 million dollars to carry out the same kind of insurgency that the Pakistanis carried out in the Kashmir Valley for the last 35, 40 years. And we need to do the same to them in Afghanistan. And secondly, before the Chinese and the Pakistanis start flooding opium through our western borders, we should take the initiative and install Indian businessmen in Tajikistan to actually start supplying opium, because Tajikistan is the transit route through which Afghan opium goes to Moscow, and start supplying opium to Xinjiang. We've done it in the 18th century. We've done it in the 19th century. Let's use it as a weapon of war in the 20th century. We need low-cost options today to counter the Chinese and the Pakistanis. And I think these are two ways of thinking out of the box to provide and exercise countervailing power against the Pakistanis and the Chinese who are breathing down our necks in Ladakh and in the Kashmir Valley. Those are my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Iqbal. If we have the political will to put into action, it can fetch us good dividends, no doubt.
Let's hope so.
Thanks, Iqbal. All the best.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
I think we've covered a lot of ground, but in any case, Afghanistan is a story which is not going to end so soon. But thank you very much, Janet Sharma, Maruf, and Iqbal, even if we lost him, the lot that he brought out. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.